So one of the strange things about lockdown has been that the normal work that I tend to do, the work of academic production, if you want to call it that, research, writing, publishing, the work that I'm doing has been interrupted. So the normal process, particularly when it comes to writing a chapter in a book or editing a book or writing a book, is that you sit down, you work out what it is that you're wanting to research. Normally we would think about some kind of a problem or an issue that we're wanting to understand more carefully. You put together a research project with some clear research questions, develop a bit of a process, choose a methodology that you think will best help you to understand the issue, find some funding, and then you get cracking. And after a year or two of working on it, you normally have some findings or results or discoveries or ideas that you want to share. And then it takes you a little bit of time to capture those, to write them up, to get them to the publisher. They undergo peer review from your peers, and then they get published. And that's where some of the happiness comes. I must say, I really enjoy the research process, but the kind of feedback loop that comes after that is the loop of then getting to launch your book, to see it in print. Now, during lockdown this year, this is 2020, it's June, I've actually had 3 volumes that I was editor of, published and released. The first one that came was this book, which is a book which I did with my colleagues Elizabeth Girl and Joran Gunnar. And it's entitled Freedom of Religion at Stake, Competing Claims Amongst Faith Traditions, States and Persons. And it's a project which we did this one's published by Pickwick, Wipf and Stock Publishers. And this was a project that we did with the Church of Sweden, their research series, and 2 other partners, STIAS, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, and the Beyers Naudé Center for Public Theology, of which I'm the director. And the intention was to look at how freedom of religion or religious freedom is configured in different ways in different contexts, particularly in Africa and in Europe, to see how the sort of socio-cultural understanding of religion, how religion figures in public life, how that relates to the ways in which individuals, communities, and states think about the place and the role of religion in society. And needless to say, the book contains a number of really, really excellent reflections. Some of the introductory work, for example, by Henny Kotze, the comparative work between Sweden and South Africa, some really, really unique chapters. Elizabeth Girl's own chapter, which speaks about, the sort of notion of religion and how it came to be categorized, the sort of philosophical thought process about it. When did we begin to think about something as being a religion or religious? How did we come to adopt certain categories to be able to say that is religion or theology and the other is secular? So getting behind the sort of history and philosophy of it. Joran's own work, which looks very much at sort of the intersections between religion, theology, and law. I wrote something around freedom of religion and the complexities of adopting hard and fast sort of normative rules around religion and freedom, and used the case of in the 1980s, after the second state of emergency, how the apartheid state used certain understandings of the role of religion in society to silence political activists, Christian political activists. But now under the new South African dispensation, in the new South Africa, where we seem to have, at least in political terms, a more just political dispensation, we find that we have these persons who really abuse the rights of citizens. I cite the case of the pastor of doom. Doom is an insecticide which is used in South Africa to kill bugs, and this pastor was spraying doom onto his parishioners in order for them to be sort of miraculously and spiritually healed. And looking at what role does the state have in curtailing religious freedom, because clearly, that could harm individuals, and the state has a responsibility to protect its citizens. And so what is the role of the state there? Has the state got a right to say there are certain things that religious persons shouldn't be able to do? And how far does that stretch? For example, during the apartheid years, they said, well, there's certain gatherings that religious persons shouldn't be allowed to attend, like anti-apartheid gatherings or gatherings that were opposed to the apartheid state, and certain things they're not allowed to say. And where do we draw those lines? So this really is, this was such an exceedingly important book in my own career and in my own work. And my late colleague, Professor Mary-Ann Plaatjes van Huffel, who passed away just over a month ago on the 19th of May, she wrote a really wonderful chapter in here looking at South Africa's multi-faith constitution. We don't have a secular constitution in South Africa. We recognize that religion is important, that it matters, that there are religious persons, and trying to work out what does it look like when you have a multi-faith constitution, but you have one religious grouping, Christianity in this case, that dominates the public sphere. About, I think, 84.2% of South Africans say that they are Christian. Now, what does that mean in public schools, for example, where a headmaster, the majority of parents, and possibly even the majority of children might share a particular faith perspective? Yeah, the other chapter which I thought was particularly interesting was the chapter which was written by one of our colleagues, colleague Mdende. And she wrote, Nokozula Mdende, she wrote a chapter on African traditional religion and freedom of religion in South Africa, also in relation to Christianity. We can see how colonialism, when the missionaries came and the ideas around culture, tradition, and African religion, which were brought here in the late 1700s, 1800s, have clouded even contemporary Christian understandings. And she asked the question, what do we do about the realization that we come to discover that Africa has never been a godless continent, that people had religious views and practices and rituals long before Christianity arrived, and how does this Christian-dominated country in which we live, even Christian politically dominated country in which we live, deal with religious difference and religious preference in the African context? So that's freedom of religion at stake. I'll put a link to all of the books in the show notes, and this one was edited by myself, Dion Foster, by Elizabeth Yule and Yuran Gunnar. Then the second book, which really was a wonderful book, a couple of years in the making, is this book here, Reconciliation, Forgiveness and Violence in Africa, Biblical, Pastoral and Ethical Perspectives. And this is the very first book in the newly founded Unit for Reconciliation and Justice, which is headed by one of the editors of the book, Christo Tesnal. Christo is a wonderful friend and colleague and a specialist around issues of reconciliation, justice, forgiveness. He did his own doctoral work some years ago around South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and has gone on to be an expert in that field. Now, what we wanted to do in this work particularly was we wanted to look at how certain disciplines were engaging issues of reconciliation, forgiveness, and violence in Africa. And in our case, we chose three different disciplines. We chose colleagues and students from biblical studies, so Hebrew Bible and New Testament, from pastoral theology and pastoral and practical theology, that's where Christo operates, and then from systematic theology and ethics, mainly in the areas of public theology. And so you'll find in the book different methodological approaches to how Christians are dealing with issues of reconciliation, forgiveness, and violence in Africa. And so we have, for example, contributions from Nigeria about interreligious conflict between Christianity and Islam and how churches should respond to that. We have chapters from Ethiopia. Perhaps one of the most remarkable chapters was from one of my former doctoral students, Dr. Elise Brown. And sadly, Elise also passed away just in late March, very, very suddenly. And she looks at the issue of race and identity. So, how we find these conflicting understandings and notions of race and identity. Just to say, the afterword, the reflection, is written by Dr. Wilhelm Verwoerd, and he in himself is a very remarkable South African individual. His grandfather was one of the apartheid presidents, H.F. Verwoerd. And Wilhelm himself came to the realization early on in his life what the evils of apartheid were doing to South Africa, and had to engage his family around this, and that was a very difficult relationship, finding himself disowned and disregarded by members of his own family, and asking questions about the rehumanization of himself and his family, and how one journeys through the complexities of an adopted view of the world, which was influenced by religion and politics and culture and all of these social identity markers. And so what Wilhelm does is, towards the end of the book, his particular chapter is entitled Transforming Christian Apartheid. He looks at the intersections of belief and politics in relation to the violence, the structural and ongoing violence of apartheid. I had a chapter in here in which I worked with some of my previous research from this book, which I wrote. This is the Wipf & Stock version, The Impossibility of Forgiveness, which was published by Wipf & Stock in 2019, but used some of the research which was done for that book and looked at the politics of forgiveness. So asking the question, why is it that white South Africans want to be forgiven for the sins of apartheid? Is it so that they can be free to work for a better future for all South Africans? Or is it to be free from the consequences and expectations for reparation, for justice to be done, to be truly reconciled? So I look very specifically at the poem of a South African poet named Nathan Trantral, who speaks about die gif in vergifnis. That's an Afrikaans word. Vergifnis is the Afrikaans word for forgiveness. And in the middle of that word, vergifnis, the word gif means poison. And he writes about the poison in certain kinds of forgiveness. So forgiveness without justice. So my own work looks at that. And this is a really wonderful book. We are hoping to have an online virtual book launch for this in the not too distant future. So Professor Marius Nel, the one editor, he is from New Testament Studies, myself, Dion Foster, and two of my colleagues, Jaco Buerta and our late colleague Elise Brown, who is from Systematic Theology, and then Professor Christo Tesnal with two of his doctoral graduates and students. And the book itself is dedicated to the memory of the late Professor Russell Botman, who was a well-known theologian, public theologian indeed, anti-apartheid activist, and was the rector of the University of Stellenbosch. Now, the last book, and you'll see a little video on this one on my channel as well, is this book, African Public Theology. And I had the privilege of being a co-editor and an author in this book with Professor Sunday Ahang, who is an extraordinary professor at the University of Stellenbosch. Of course, myself, Dion Foster, and then Professor Jurgens Hendricks, who is an emeritus professor in practical theology at the University of Stellenbosch, and one of the leaders in a grouping called NetAct, the Network for African Christian Theological Institutions and Training Colleges. Now, this, I want to say, is probably one of the most important projects I've ever been a part of. This book, 430 pages, 30 chapters, looks at the notion of public theology in the varying African context. So all 30 chapters are written by authors from across the continent, and really some wonderful issues here. We begin, first of all, by looking at is there a need for a public theology in Africa? Then I wrote a chapter on the nature and character of public theology. What do we see as some of the characteristics of public theologies throughout the world, but also in Africa? And then we go on to looking at public theology and the Bible, public theology as it relates to the church and various aspects of life. And then we have a whole series of chapters that deal with issues like democracy, policing and the military, the environment, gender, medicine, the arts, the media, education, the youth, science. I'm just trying to think of others, economics and poverty, human rights, leadership, and intergenerational issues. So there are a whole host of issues that we deal with here. And then the third part of the book begins to sort of land some of that. So at the end of each chapter, we actually included additional reading and some questions for discussion. And so the book is intended not just to be an academic theological text, but something that pastors, that Christians, that groups of Christians throughout the continent can use to reflect about the public nature of our faith. You know, the reality is that there is no such thing as private theology. I mean, all faith, if it is held sincerely, will have a public effect. If you believe things and you believe them to be true, they're going to change the ways in which you act, in which you live, in which you structure your own personal life, your private life, but also from there, how you structure your social life, your community life, what you aspire to, what you're willing to allow, what you don't want to allow. So this thinks about those complexities throughout the continent. So yeah, these three books, African Public Theology, Reconciliation, Forgiveness and Violence in Africa, and Freedom of Religion at Stake, were three projects that came to fruition during the lockdown. Many of them were begun naturally, as I say, some years ago, and took a couple of years to get all of the authors to submit their chapters. I can tell you that's always a difficult task. Then for them to be reviewed by the editors, for them to go through the blind peer review processes, and then of course for us to request changes and finalize the text so that the printers could print them. And then, you know, the lockdown came and some of them weren't printed yet, and we had to wait until that could happen. And now we're at the stage in late June where people are beginning to be able to order the books. So I can say all three of the books are available on international platforms like Amazon. If you're in South Africa, African Public Theology, I mean, this book is priced at an incredible price, and we're so grateful to Langham Publishers. Hippo Books, which is the imprint of this, makes it particularly affordable for persons in the majority world. So this book costs only 350 Rand for 30 chapters, 430 pages, and that really is an excellent price. I think it's about 12 or 15 pounds, somewhere around there, probably $15 or so if you're buying it overseas. And then, the other books also, they're available on Amazon.com, and of course you can search for them on Google Books. And I'll place links to all of them in the show notes. And of course also my other book, The Impossibility of Forgiveness. So I'll put links to all of those in the show notes. But just to say thanks very much for watching this video. As a scholar who bears some moral responsibility to give an account for the kind of work that I do, it's a joy to be able to share with you the publication of these resources, and to be able to tell you what has been done by others, and the privilege that I've had to play a small role in that, and to encourage you, if you can order them for your library, if you can review them for a journal that you're involved in, or if you're looking for some great reading material for a project that you're involved in, or you're interested to find out more about any of these issues, then please do order the books. I can tell you one thing. Authors who write for academic purposes never retire on the proceeds of their books. The royalties that we get most often just go towards covering the cost of publication. So I stand to gain nothing out of it other than the joy of knowing that people are reading the work that we've been involved in and thinking about the issues that we care about, and hopefully finding it useful. So thanks for watching this video. It fits into the series. It's not a lecture, just a thought. And for those who are interested, just to mention, we now have a podcast by that name, which is available on Apple Podcasts, entitled It's Not a Lecture, Just a Thought, 100 episodes, which were pre-recorded between myself and Alan Story, reading the Bible together from the hermeneutic perspectives of justice and peace. You can find that on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts, it's on Spotify and other places. So please, I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. And please subscribe to my channel on YouTube, or if you have this on Facebook, Dion A. Foster, or find more details on my website, dionfoster.com. So thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any comments or suggestions or questions. It's always wonderful to be in touch. Stay well.